Hi everyone, welcome back to the Quilters Guild of Ireland home project, which we're running with support from the Keep Well campaign in conjunction with the Design and Crafts Council of Ireland. So the project is that we're asking members and friends and neighbors and relatives and whoever has an interest in making a block to make a patchwork block on the theme of home. So home in our mind for this project is a block with a house on it, a tree on it, or paths and gardens. And we're providing 9 patterns to give you inspiration to make a block. They all have to finish at 10 inches, which means their unfinished size is 10.5 inches. These patterns are available through the Quilters Guild of Ireland. If you'd like one and you haven't found one yet, you can contact us at the QGI@gmail.com, or you can contact us through Facebook. This is the 4th pattern. So this is the 2nd tree pattern that I'm going to demonstrate today. And it is comprised of 2 sky pieces, a piece of trunk fabric, and a piece of fabric for the tree, and 2 pieces for the upper sky. This is going to be foundation pieced, and this is the foundation that I'm going to use. So these are all included in the pattern, which is formatted to A4 standard, just in case you're in another part of the world. I've never demonstrated paper piecing on camera, so I hope that I can explain this well for those of you who may be giving it a go for the first time. The measurements I provided are quite generous for the sky pieces on the top in particular, because I find if they're not quite generous, it's easy to miss the mark when you're foundation piecing. So what I would do is, to start with, turn this right side down and take your piece of sky or your piece of tree fabric, which I wouldn't be worried about these because I've cut beyond the seam allowance anyway, and I'm using batiks, so there is really no right or wrong side, but this would be the right side that you're seeing. So if you were concerned about right or wrong side, you'll be looking at the right side. So we're going to sew from the back of it, and I've got, just checking on where the seams are, I'm going to put a pin down here just to hold this, and I'm going to put another pin up here, and hopefully that pin isn't going to be in the way. Then I'm going to turn this over, use a postcard, and put that postcard just inside the line and fold this over. And then using a ruler and a rotary cutter, I'm going to trim this to 1/4 inch, which will give me my placement and seam allowance. And excuse me, I took my rotary cutter away, so I have to go across the room and grab it. So just make sure that that's correct, and then I'm going to cut this. And I'll save that piece for a future project, or I'll give it to someone who makes wonderful things with tiny pieces of fabric. And do the same on the other side. So again, I'm lining that 1/4 inch seam up. I'm just going to gently move this and move these little bettines out of the way so they're not cut into by mistake. And cut that. So I'll set that aside as well. You could cut the tree to the correct size, but that gets into using the angles on your ruler, and I figured beginners might not be comfortable doing that, so I was trying to make it as easy as possible. So then you take these 2 pieces are going to go like this. As you can see, they're quite a bit bigger, but when you account for this angle and pulling it back around, it's easy to get it wrong. So I would go place it something like that. And again, as I've said in other videos, I'm kind of averse to pinning in general, but this is an occasion where I probably would pin, particularly if I'm using printer paper, because it's a little bit slippy, which is what I'm using. And printer paper is absolutely fine. It's just it's a little bit slippery. And I'm now going to go over to my sewing machine, and I'll bring the slightly wobbly camera with me. And I'm going to sew. So I'm actually going to pull this out of the way because that thread might get in the way. I'm going to sew on the line. I'm going to try to anyway. I'm using quite a small stitch length. I'm using about just under 2. I normally use 2 anyways, so it's maybe a smidgen smaller than I would normally use. The reason for using a small stitch length in this exercise or this kind of sewing is this paper is going to get torn off, and that's going to put a bit of pressure on the seam. And if you use a normal stitch length, you might find that your stitch gets pulled out or damaged. So just makes it a little bit easier. Now here's the moment of truth. We'll see if this worked. So we turn this back over, take these pins out. I'm going to leave the pins in the green fabric for the moment, and then I'm going to open this up and finger press it, and I want to turn it over. And yes, this did work. I did this earlier and it didn't work, so I'd use a slightly smaller piece of sky fabric. All of these points, all these seam allowances need to be covered. So if you find that your fabric is sitting like this, your piece of fabric wasn't big enough, or you didn't place it well, and you may have to unpick it and try it again. For those of you who have done paper piecing, you know that this is the disadvantage. The advantage is you get points wonderfully easily. Well, I don't know if I should say easily, but points come together quite nicely. The downside is that if you don't have things positioned correctly, then you end up having to re-sew it. So I suppose there's pros and cons to everything. So I'm going to pin the second piece in place, and just making sure that that seam allowance is pretty well situated. And I'll come back to the sewing machine, and again, try to stay on that line as closely as possible. If you veer off a tiny bit, I wouldn't be too worried about it, but do try to stay as close as possible. Go as fast or slow as suits you to allow you to keep your precision. I have to say, sewing with the camera next to my left arm does impact my precision a little bit, so I'm going to make excuses for myself today. But I would try to be as precise as possible. So take those pins out, and I took the pins out of the green fabric as well, and those seams are also all covered, or all the seam allowances are covered. I'm going to take that back to the cutting table, but before I do, because I have the camera here at the sewing machine, I'm going to sew this tree trunk to the sky, and it's just a wee bit of sewing for the bottom of the tree. This could have all been done foundation pieced, but due to the size of the block, because it's a 10-inch block, that would mean using either A3 paper, or if you're in America or any place where they use non-standard, it would mean using legal size, I think would be the closest. So as people don't necessarily have that, and they certainly don't necessarily have that in their printer, I thought I'd adapt the pattern so that it could be done with a normal printer paper. If you were printing this stateside, make sure that you print it according to A4 standards. You can make that adjustment on your printer. You may lose the number at the top and bottom of the sheet or something. You may lose a tiny bit at the top of the bottom, but you'll get the gist of the pattern anyway. And I'm actually going to press the seam allowance into the tree so the tree trunk pops out a small bit. So that's the tree trunk. And then I'm going to take the camera very gently back here, try not to make anyone seasick. And I'm happy with this. I'm actually going to press it before I cut because it's I don't want to find that it stretches a little bit after pressing. So I'll give that a quick press. And I'm now going to cut on these lines just inside, just you can just see the seam allowance. So my hope is that I'm cutting on the seam allowance by doing this. So that's the top of the tree, paper piece tree. Now to sew this to the next piece, I really need to get rid of the paper. So what I'm going to do is turn this over, crease the paper. The sewing has actually perforated the paper to a large extent. And do the same on the other side. You could sew this to the next piece with the paper in, but then it's just more paper to have to unpick through a seam allowance, and I can't see any point. Sometimes if you've got a block that's quite irregularly shaped, you might want to leave the paper in for stability until you're absolutely finished constructing the block. But in this case, it's not really going to make much difference. So you can see as I'm pulling, it is putting a bit of pressure on those seams, those little threads. So that's it, ready to go. I'm going to sew this to the trunk in the sky that I have off to the side here. Hopefully they match up. They do. This is only half the block, by the way. There is another tree trunk to be attached to it. I'm aware that this video is already going to be close to 15 minutes. So what I'll do is I'll make the second tree trunk, or the second tree, a second video. And that video will have the assembly of the two trees into one block. There you are. So that is the left-hand tree for the second tree block, and the right-hand tree and the sewing together the two blocks will be another video. Thank you.